The video you're about to see is a slight departure from the usual Comenechtri Skiedewak style, and there's a reason for that I'll explain in just a moment. But first, take a look at this short scene from the Coen Brothers 2016 movie Hail Caesar.
It's the foundation of our belief that Christ is most properly referred to as the Son of God. It's the Son of God who takes the sins of the world upon himself so that the rest of God's children, we imperfect beings, through faith, may enter the kingdom of heaven.
So God is split?
Yes and no.
God doesn't have children. He's a bachelor and very angry.
No, he used to be angry.
What, he got over it?
You worship the God of another age.
Who has no love.
Not true. He likes Jews.
God loves everyone.
God is love.
God is who is.
This is special. Who isn't who is?
But how should God be rendered in a motion picture?
God isn't in the motion picture.
Gentlemen, maybe we're biting off more than we can chew.
Now, the priest that you saw there making a spirited case to studio boss Josh Brolin was played by an actor called Robert Pike Daniel, whose mother was from Gress. And Robert was recently at home for a very brief time visiting some of his relations in Lewis. We didn't have time to get our normal top interviewer on the case, but as I happened to be at lunch with him because he's a cousin of my mother's, I thought it was worthwhile recording some snippets from his life story because it's inherently a fascinating story, and also because it's somewhat emblematic, I think, of many families in Skiedewak whose members left the island for work and went to far distant corners of the earth. Certainly that's literally true of Robert. Anyway, in his own words, here is an interview recorded with Robert Pike Daniel in the County Hotel in Stornoway.
Well, my mother was born and raised in Gress, to Gress. My grandfather, Ghoidy, was one of the raiders and had fought against Leverhulme to eventually get the croft that he did get, and he built the house himself once he had the land. And my mother was born there in 1916. And now that I think of the dates, if he built the house after the war, she couldn't have been born there. She must have been born elsewhere, but she was raised there from a very young age. And she came from Africa, pregnant with me, and I was born at number 2 Gress, as many other members of the family were. My cousin Peggy Màiri told me the other day, she said, "You were born in the bed downstairs in the front room." I said, "Yes." She said, "So was I." So
your mother was Màiri Ghoidy, as people in back would know her?
She was Màiri Ghoidy, yes. And it's very interesting how the nicknames in the island are used. They're far more well known than the actual names of people themselves. And when I was here the last time, in a magazine, I can't remember what it was, but there was a little story about Ghoidy, and this would be years ago. The boys from back used to love to come across late in the afternoon after school and throw pebbles from the street onto Ghoidy's roof. And of course it would clatter down into the gutter, and it annoyed Ghoidy tremendously. And he would come racing out and chase them down the street, and off to back they'd go, running as fast as they could. And this one time, the one brought his 4-year-old brother. And when they all ran, the 4-year-old couldn't run as fast as the others, so Ghoidy did catch him. And Ghoidy frog marched this wee boy back to back. Bang, bang, bang on the door. And he scolded the mother for allowing these boys to do that. And it was a charming little story. Everything I knew about Ghoidy, he wasn't a fierce man, he wasn't an angry man. You know, it was just, I think he'd had stones thrown on his roof too often. But 3 weeks after I was born, my mother set off back to to Africa. So I was born here and raised for 3 weeks in Gress, and then back to Africa I went. And
how did Africa come into your mother's life?
she, very interestingly, had an aunt who lived in London, and she worked below stairs in Mayfair in a fancy house. And I don't know how she arranged it, but she got a job for my mother, and my mother went down and worked in Mayfair. And during 1939, at some point, she saw an advert in the paper. Lady De Beer was traveling back from the UK to South Africa, and they never traveled alone, women, either with the husbands. If no husbands, they got a companion. So my mother applied for the job and was hired as a companion to Lady De Beer. She got to Durban, South Africa. Lady De Beer went up to the Johannesburg area. My mother stayed in Durban and thought, I'll work for a short period before I go back, get some money together. And she did, during which time the war broke out, and that effectively trapped her there. And she was working at a place called Baker's Limited. It was quite a big bakery. And that's where she met my father. And they obviously, I don't know what the term was in those days. Today you'd say they dated.
Yeah.
And the war was ongoing, so he then signed up and off he went. And I don't know whether they proposed before or proposed while he was gone, but they did decide to marry. So he came into port for a week in 1942. And on the 4th of July, which is very interesting, I live in Los Angeles now, the 4th of July is, Independence Day, and they got married. He was in Durban for a total of a week, and then off he went, and she didn't see him again for the next 4 years, which is amazing when you think about it. You marry, you're together for a matter of days, and then you don't see each other again for 4 years. And he came back in 46. There was always this biscuit tin, an old biscuit tin that was slightly rusty. And my mother didn't tell us that that's what it was, but somehow we found out that that's where all the love letters were. Over this 4-year period, backwards, forwards, writing. And there was a very interesting little sideline. When she was working below stairs in Mayfair, after she died in 2003, a lot of her documents came to me. And amongst them was this letter dated 1934 from a well-known author in those days. He wrote about the islands. And right now, I wish I could give you his name, but I can't. I can't remember it. But he was well known at the time. And she had obviously read the book, loved it, and had written to him. And it's very interesting. He writes back to her, and it's quite an extensive letter, and he loved the fact that she liked it, and he chatted about life in the islands and all of that, and he knew she was from Lewis. But the address on the top left hand of the envelope was this Mayfair address. So I'm not sure if he knew that when he received the letter it was from a woman working below stairs, but he did see a Mayfair address. So I think he might have thought it was a hoi polloi writing to him, and that's why he responded in that way. But when we went to London just a few years ago, I was staying in Mayfair, so I went to that address to look it up. And as was the case in those days, the entire street on one side and the other were all similar houses, identical, except right there in the middle of this row something had happened, and there were 2 new houses, same level, everything, but they didn't match anything else in the row. So I did a little further research, and very interestingly, during the Blitz, Mayfair was hit quite hard, and those 2 houses were flattened during the Blitz, which is interesting because if Molly had stayed on working below stairs and hadn't gone to Africa, she'd probably be dead from that. So that was an interesting little anecdote. Yeah.
So, born in Gress, any memories? What's your first memories, really? Of you don't remember, obviously, that time. What were your first memories of being in Africa? Is that right?
Well, the first memories based on my own sensibilities,
Yeah.
eyes, ears, and all of that, would be Africa. But I'm married to a woman who was born in Nottingham, in England, but her mother is Italian, and the father was in the war in Italy, met the mother, and brought her to England. And my wife sees herself as fully English, but she's not. She's clearly half Italian. She speaks Italian. She cooks brilliantly Italian food. And it shows the effect that those types of domestic arrangements have. I remember in South Africa when the Lions rugby team was touring, they'd be playing Natal, which was the province that we lived in, where Durban was. And all the schoolboys would get on the buses and off we'd go to see the matches. And all the other boys would be yelling and screaming for Natal, the local boys. And quietly, I couldn't say it out loud, but quietly I'd be rooting for the Lions. Because when you're raised by a British mother, no matter where you are in the world, and she chooses to let you know a lot about your past, your history, and all the rest of it, you end up kind of twisted. You're raised in South Africa, and there's a lot about South Africa that you like, but you've got all of this history that your mother has put into you about McGregor, Robert the Bruce, Culloden, Bannockburn, and you know a lot about that, so you almost feel part of Scotland, and yet you were born here but only left it after 3 weeks, so you remember nothing, but you still feel very, very Scottish. I came back for the first time in 1969, and none of it was visually familiar to me, but just the feel, the sensibility around me, it was like coming home. It was very, very strange. And going to Gress, number 2, I'd never seen it before, but knowing that after the raiders were granted their crofts and Ghoidy had built it with his own hands, and the family, he'd raised a family in that house, and of course knowing that I'd been born in the downstairs bed in which half the family apparently had been born, it was amazing to walk into that and to feel it all again.
And who did you meet when you were over at that time? Do you remember which of the relations were still around in the house then?
Marianne and Tommy, I think, were still living in Perth. Later, they came up and settled after he retired. They settled in the home. At the time, Ghoidy, my grandfather, was gone, my grandmother was gone. It might have been right from the outset that Marianne and Tommy were there. That's Marianne, my aunt, yeah, my mother's sister. But whenever we'd go up, there'd be Peggy and Norman from Birmingham would be up there. And so there'd be always a group of us. And Neelan, who was my mother's brother, he worked the loom in the barn outside. He had a section of the barn for his loom. That was always, I learned the pipes, to play the pipes in South Africa.
The Scottish heritage.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yes, but my mother was going to have that happen. So at about the age of 11, I was taken to meet Pipe Major Jock Porteous, and it's very interesting. He was just in the process of buying a new set of pipes, silver mounted, and the pipes that he had were an old set of Hendersons with the ivory mounts. So my dad bought those from him for me as my first set of pipes. And whenever I went up there, I always had the pipes with me. And Neelan was stone deaf. How it had happened, there's many stories in the family as to various incidents, apparently a gun going off close to his ear or whatever. No one ever quite knows why he was stone deaf. But he would come out of the loom shed and ask, "Ooh, Robert, would you play the pipes for me?" And I'd say, yeah, okay. And the first time he did it, I thought, what is this about? The man is deaf, he can't hear me. And he'd sit on the steps, there were 2 steps going into the loom shed, and he'd sit on the top step, and I would march up and down. And as I was marching up and down in front of him playing, his foot was going. It was tapping. And I thought, he must be hearing this. And then I realized what he was doing is he was watching my feet. And each time my foot went down, he was tapping in time to my feet. But and I think he was watching my fingers. Now, what that meant to him, and whether he was imagining a sound or something, he must have been, because he seemed to enjoy it, because he would often ask me, oh, would you get the pipes and play me a tune? But it was fascinating. Yeah, so in those early days, it was Marianne and Tommy, and Norman and Peggy, and the days were they were very simple. You'd get up in the morning, you'd have a very specific breakfast, then at lunchtime at a very specific time, you'd have lunch. Everyone would be at the table, and the conversations were almost invariably, at least half of lunch was a discussion about potatoes. the new potatoes, this potatoes, the King Edwards, which was better, which one was just about to come into season. And the first time it happened, I was quite surprised that they spoke at that length about potatoes. But then it happened the next day, and the day after, and the day after, and you thought, oh my God, how do we talk so much about potatoes?
So, going back a wee bit in Africa, your father went back to the baking after the war, I take it? You didn't follow in his footsteps, though?
No, I'm not sure when he came out of school that he was certain what he wanted to do, and I think he kind of stumbled into that, into baking. He worked his way up the ladder, and he ended up as a general manager of one of the biggest, was the biggest bakery in Cape Town, and he became well known for he could take a 200-pound sack of flour and get more loaves of bread out of that than anyone else could. Nobody was quite sure what his secret was. And of course, the more loaves you can get out of a sack of flour, the more profit you make. And it was interesting. He would come home for lunch every day and sit in the kitchen, and this was in Cape Town. It was in an area called Newlands. And from the kitchen with the door open, you could see right up Table Mountain. It was right there behind you. You could see up Table Mountain. If there was a hiker going up the mountain, you'd see the little white dot moving. And he'd walk in with his loaf of bread. He always brought a loaf of bread back at lunchtime. And it would take 30 seconds before my mother would be very, very pejorative about his bread. She hated it because it wasn't very dense. It couldn't be dense if you're going to get more loaves out of that than anybody else. What he was basically doing was using water to do what he was doing. He put water in. He was able to put more water into 200 pounds of flour, and therefore get more loaves out of it, however he was doing it. And she was never complimentary about his bread. She always ran it down. But those were fond memories. My father was born in Pretoria, so he was South African. But again, he was born to an Irish mother who'd gone out to see her sister, who was a nun in Kimberley. And she met in Pretoria my father's father, my grandfather, and he'd come from County Tyrone. And his family was very, very interesting. We thought they were Irish. And my father, most of his life, thought he was a green Irishman. And it was only later in life, when I had to do some research into the family, that I discovered we actually came originally from Newbury, 30 miles outside London. And they had a horse estate there. And the young Richard Pike went to Ireland with Cromwell in 1848. And that was never a nice piece of history, because Cromwell went into into Ireland and did some dreadful things to the Irish. But soon after he arrived there, he went to a meeting conducted by a man called William Burroughs. George Fox created the Quakers in 1842, and this was 6, 7, 8 years later. William Burroughs was traveling through Ireland giving speeches, and my grandfather was, they never said converted, they said convinced of the truth. So my grandfather was convinced of the truth. And cut a long story short, we then discovered they became very close with William Penn. And the son, Joseph, used to go to the meetings in Amsterdam with William Penn. And then later he gave 2,000 acres of what is today the center of Philadelphia to Joseph. And it remained in the family for a long, long time. He left it to his wife when he passed, and she left it to the son. And it was many years after that that it was sold to 2 businessmen in London. But because of that association, when I first went to America in 1987, I was the first ever of my family to be there. And so everything was new to me and to be learned. But I later discovered, because of Joseph's association with Penn, with William Penn, he was a Quaker, a devout Quaker, and he published a lot of treatises for Quaker readership. And his printer, I discovered, was Benjamin Franklin, the man on the $100 note. And so you suddenly realize, oh my God, you were not the first person here. There was a lot more involvement in America than you could ever have imagined. And but that's a digression from the Scottish side. That's just a little touch of the Irish side. So when you have that kind of foreign influence on you, and you're growing up in India, Sri Lanka, South Africa, wherever, it's very, very hard to be simply an Indian or simply a South African, because you've got all of this cultural stuff coming at you the whole time, you know. So and suppose today, especially after 1994, I got into a little trouble in '64. I was at University of Cape Town, and
Studying, what were you studying?
I started out doing law, but we had to do, there were a couple of optional courses. One of the courses that we had to take was Latin. I didn't have much interest in that because it's based on Roman Dutch law, South African law. I met Sheriff David Sutherland 2 days ago in the dining room here, and I mentioned something about South African law, and he said, same as Scottish law. I said, Roman Dutch? And he said, absolutely. And he was telling me a little about the basis of the law here, and he had studied Latin as well at college. I took to the social sciences just automatically. I don't know why. We had to do industrial sociology. Now, if you said to me, oh, what is industrial sociology as opposed to sociology? I don't know. We studied just, it seemed to me, basically sociology. And the interesting, like a lot of the social sciences, you start out at the beginning learning new definitions for words. We've got all these English words that have existed for centuries and they all mean something, but no, the sociologists have a slightly different meaning, and you have to learn that meaning for that word. And then there's another word that has a slightly different meaning. And it struck me as very strange. But a lot of that stuff is logic. It really is. If you use common sense and you have a fairly unbiased view of the world, a lot of the stuff you can work out. So it came to me very naturally. I wasn't particularly interested in the law. My mother was very keen for me to be a lawyer, so you know, that's the direction we went in. But I ended up as an actor, and she hated that. She never ever approved of it. She thought I'd wasted my life. She would tell me that, you wasted your life. And I was, I think, 49 in Los Angeles, working.
So you moved to Los Angeles to follow your career?
Yeah, I moved in. When did we go? We went to Nashville to start with in 1987. I went to Los Angeles in 1993, and it was maybe 3 or 4 years after that. To get yourself into the game, you've got to be noticed. So you should do quite a bit of theatre in the hope that there's a producer or somebody out in the house who says, and I was doing a show called The Enchanted Forest. It's an old play, written, I think, in the earlier part of the 20th century, obviously after World War I, because it touches on the events of World War I, the play itself. And my mother was coming down. She was living with my sister at the time. My father had already passed, and she was living with my sister in Vancouver. So she would come down and spend 3 weeks here and there with me in Los Angeles. And when we decided the dates for this visit, it was some months before. I hadn't known about this show. Now I'm in this show. Now we have the Sunday matinee, and she's arriving on the Sunday. So I have to get somebody from the theater to go pick her up. And they say, should I just take her straight to your apartment? And I said, yep. And then I thought, no, she's not that familiar with it. She'll go and try and make a cup of tea, and she's gonna trip a circuit, and something will go wrong. And so I said, no, bring her to the theater. So, and it was interesting. The play has the character Major Hillgrove, who was blinded in World War I. And that's the character I was playing. And we go all the way through the show. End of the show, I go back to the dressing room, I'm taking off my makeup, and somebody, the person who picked her up said, your mum's waiting out front. I said, oh my God, I'd forgotten. Oh. Cleaned up very quickly, went out to her, and hi, how was the flight? Oh, very good. And did you enjoy the show? She said, oh, yes. I said, oh, excellent. She said, by the way, I said, oh? She said, I can see why you wanted to be an actor. It was her way of paying me a compliment. I was 49 years old, and for the first time in my life to get that kind of compliment from my mother, who had always said I'd wasted my life. It was a very, very interesting moment. I don't resent anything about being raised by her. She was severe. She was one of those ladies who didn't work, but at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when school was over and you walked in the door, she would feed you and then want to know what your homework was. And if you needed help with it and she could help, she would. But you had to follow all kinds of regimens. When I took up the pipes, she took a keen interest, and she made sure I didn't slacken. You know, when competitions were coming up, I would practice 2-3 hours a day. And I remember I was playing in the under 13 national championship in South Africa. And you have to play the slow march, the march, Strathspey and Reel. And there was a third thing, and they aggregate the marks for all three, and you're then first, second, third. I happened to win the national championship. So I'm all excited, and I'm looking for them because they're soon going to be presenting this big trophy. It was a big plaque with all these smaller silver plaques on with the names of previous winners. So I can't find them. Eventually I have to go up. They present the award. Everybody else is there, everyone else is clapping except my parents. I wonder, where are they? And as I'm walking across, it was Kingsmead Cricket Ground in Durban. As I'm walking across the field, there I see them coming in the distance. I go, wow. So I go hurrying up to them. My mother says, what's that? I said, it's the championship. I won. She said, oh, really? I said, yes. She said, what were your marks? I said, I got 2 firsts and a second. And she said, what was the second? That's the way she would respond to that. Not kind of, oh, wonderful, wonderful. My boys won a national championship. What was the second? You know, nowadays I think back to it. There was a time when I thought, no, she's too severe. But no, she wasn't.
She wanted the best for you.
Absolutely. It wasn't that that generation lived through their offspring, but I do remember her saying to all of us, my 4 sisters and me, on a number of occasions, you will do better than we did. You will go one step up. She never talked about whether our children would go one step up, but the expectation would obviously be there that if she applied that standard to us, we would apply the standard again. And all of us have ended up, because when she started out at 2 Gress, it was very, very modest, their lifestyles. I remember her once saying that she went to school barefoot at one point, and I said, what's this obviously in the summer? She said, no, in the winter. I said, snow? She said, oh yes. We walked barefoot through the snow, and I thought, wow. So she knew what hardship was, and she was determined that we wouldn't experience that or suffer that, and we didn't because of their efforts. They really went out of their way to make sure that we had what we needed. And I look back and I can only thank her for that, you know.
Yeah, I just have to say there, you mentioned that you've got 4 sisters. You've got an incredibly scattered family, although you're very close. But you're in all countries, aren't you? Pretty much, all continents rather.
You can't look at that without looking at the politics of South Africa. When my mother went there, it was just simply a British colony. No one was concerned about rights, wrongs, you know, justice, injustice. But as time went by, and we got into the 60s, it became very questionable. And I was at University of Cape Town, and this was 1968, they appointed the first ever black professor to the chair of a department, sociology. And instantly the South African government said, cancel this or we cancel the funding. It wasn't 100% funding from the government, but without government money, the university could not have operated. So the Senate got together, they debated it, and very quickly caved and withdrew the nomination. And the students were very unhappy about that, so we ended up taking over the admin building for 10 days and sitting in, and those were the days. While that was happening, the Russians were pouring into Czechoslovakia. Daniel Cohn-Bendit was leading the Red Brigades through the streets of Paris, pulling up the stones, you know. Kent State University was in trouble, and then American troops were shooting students. So it was a time of great change. My mother, of course, was dead against me being involved in that at all. And when it was all over, the Afrikaner University was about 30 miles away in Stellenbosch. And that was a very Afrikaner university, and they hated what was happening here. So we were warned that there had been meetings at Stellenbosch, and they decided that on that night they were coming and they were going to get us out of that building. And it was strange. We were a little ways up Table Mountain, and you could see across the Cape Flats. And I don't know if you remember towards the end of Field of Dreams, the Kevin Costner movie. Right at the end, it was said, build it and they will come. And right at the end, there's a night scene where you can see these lines of car headlights heading across towards where the field was. That's what we saw. We saw these cars coming, so we knew they were on the way. And we battened up the building as best we could. We'd been told some awful things that would be done, tarring and feathering to the women. So we got all the women into a particular building. But cut a long story short, by the next morning, the police said, we're pulling out and they can do what they want to. So either you leave now or you're in deep trouble. So we called it a day and we left. And I walked down the hill into the village down below, Rondebosch. And as I went, this student who lived on campus was going down to get something in his car, obviously from wealthy parents, because he was driving a very nice car. And he stopped and said, want a ride? And I hopped in, and I heard this unbelievably sublime music. It was Take 5 by, what was his name? Famous jazz player. Anyway, I said, what is this? What is this? I knew the song, but he told me, and I said, I've never. Where's it coming from? Because it was all around. He said, oh, it's the new 8-track. He had this, and in those days they were quite big. These cassettes that you had to put in, but it was absolutely phenomenal. And as the years went by, every so often you'll turn on something, or Dave Clark's Take 5 will suddenly play. And the moment, whenever I hear that music, it takes me right back to that moment after that night where I left South Africa the first time at that point and came to Britain and stayed for a short while before I went to London and worked with Peggy and Norman in Birmingham. And it was an interesting period. I had a lot of conflict because my mother had begged me to go back. And I said, I can't. And she said, oh, no, we're going to buy you a little mini miner. The mini miners at that stage were hot to trot. They were going to buy me a little mini to go back and drive up to the college every day. And I said no. Very shortly after I got to Britain, I started getting migraines. And I had migraines on and off for 20 years. Many years later, in 1992, my father died. I was in Nashville. My sister, one of my sisters, was in Washington. I called her. She was trying desperately to get a flight back so that she could be at the funeral. There was some kind of weather complications, but she couldn't get back in time. So I said, okay, I'll come to Washington and I'll be with you in Washington. And we drove up and we spent the day in Washington, during which in South Africa the funeral was taking place. And the next day we headed for Canada. I just said to my wife, I just need to keep moving. And she said, well, where are we going to go? And I didn't know. I said, I just need to keep moving. And on that very first day, I can't remember when it was, but it was early afternoon. I remember saying to my wife, I don't think I'll ever have another migraine. And I don't know where the idea came from and why I even thought of that, but that notion entered my head, and I never did, which said to me that I think the migraines, having started when they did, so soon after the events in South Africa, I think it had to do with the conflict in me over what I was doing politically and what my parents wanted me to do. And of course, when you fly in the face of your parents' wishes, no matter how much you feel you're in the right and they're wrong, it creates conflict.
There's a psychological barrier there.
Oh yeah. Just the way I said, the day after, I think it was a couple of days after he died, but it was the next day after they buried him, I come up with this, I don't think I'll ever have another migraine again, and I never did. So what caused me to say that? I can't even begin to answer that. But I do know I've never had another migraine. So I think it was connected to that conflict. Now you mentioned sisters spread out.
Yeah.
Yes, I still have a sister in Durban, South Africa, but I have a sister in Germany. I have a sister in New York, and I have a sister in Vancouver, and I'm in Los Angeles. And people say, well, how can that happen? Well, when you're raised in a country like South Africa, I left for political reasons. The twins had gone to England, and Fiona was working as a nanny. Sheena was in the process of getting married, and they just loved Britain, and they wanted to stay. Interestingly, they couldn't get British passports on the basis of my mother. I always had a British passport because I was born number 2 Gress. So I went looking for the Irish documentation to get, and we found it eventually. That's where we found out they were Quakers and all the rest of it with Richard Pike. And So they ended up staying abroad. Sheena has ended up in Germany. She married a South African whose parents were originally from Germany. So I think he got a job teaching dentistry. He's a dentist, dentistry at Aachen University, and they live near Munich now. Mary had emigrated to Canada in, I think, the late 90s, 89, 90, round about there. So she's been there for many years and is well settled. Her son now lives in northern New York State, right on one of the, so even there's another move from Vancouver to somewhere else. So we are a far-flung country, not country, family. If this were 20 years ago, it'd be a lot more difficult. But WhatsApp or Messenger makes this, today when we had a lunch for the entire family, we had all the surviving members of the Ferguson family and the McLeods together here. Right early on, as you saw, I got the four sisters on WhatsApp, and then we passed the phone around the table. And Peggy Màiri, who's a cousin on the McLeod side, got her sister in Perth on her phone. And we held the two phones together so that Peggy Màiri could talk to the other four cousins. And then we handed the phone around, and they went around the table with everybody talking to everybody else. And I've since had feedback from the girls, and they were just blown away. They were blown away that the whole family were able to talk in that way. So it was very important and very gratifying, but it's modern technology. 20 years ago, no. 20 years ago, we couldn't have done this.
No.
Yeah.
So, and just, we're running against the clock a wee bit, but so your own career, you're in Nashville, you were on stage there, and your mother finally gave you a bit of approval of your career choices.
Mm-hmm.
But then you moved to Los Angeles, and
Well, my mother came, I'd already moved to Los Angeles when she came.
Okay.
Yeah, and started off with small roles. First role I ever had was in Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And that was fun because Will Smith gets thrown in jail for some stupid thing. And I'm this really crazy guy in jail that he meets. So I played it up as crazy as I could. And the producers came up and said, we just love what this character is up to. So we're doing rewrites right now to give a little more breathing room for the character, which is great. And they did. That led to a number of other, there was a company in Los Angeles called Asylum Films. They made these very low budget. In the old days, you used to have A movies and B movies. This, I suppose, would be a D movie. Very low budget, but it's the only way to get in. There's very few roles for non-Americans. So if you want to work in this town, you have to sell yourself as an American. And it's very, very hard. I've always been great with accents. Never had problems with that. But generally, when I'm doing a Scottish accent, I'm not in Scotland. If I was in the middle of Edinburgh and I started doing a Scottish accent, I think I'd be nervous. That somebody says, "Oi, what the hell do you think you're doing? That's not quite it, boyo." So it was tough, but in the lower budget stuff, you got away with it. And that did open doors. So I ended up doing quite a lot of television work and movie roles. I suppose the most gratifying role I did in big budget movies was the one you saw, Hail Caesar, and working with the Coen brothers, the preeminent directors in Hollywood was fabulous.
Can you give us a bit of the Irish priest voice just now? Can you remember any of your lines for that?
You thought I was doing an Irish accent?
Was it Irish? Was it not Irish?
quite frankly, I don't know if I was even trying to do it. I was doing something, I remember, but they hadn't been specific as to what they were looking for.
Okay.
When you mention Irish with regards to priestly roles, I discovered I was being cast a lot. I played a priest in many movies, and it's because of the red hair and that Irish look.
Yeah.
Or they see it as the Irish look. Not every Irishman looks like this, but a few do. And so the red hair was always getting me into those roles. So the other one that I had to work hard on was old Tom Morris. I think I was telling you. Over 3 years, I did a long series of commercials for the Golf Channel. They put all of their promotional stuff into this character, and he was all over their website. Every time you went to the website, old Tom was all over the place. So that was fun. They kind of left it to me because the nice thing when you do play a foreign role, they don't know what a Scotsman is. They don't quite know. So they rely on you to give it to them. Are you giving them the real thing? They're not sure. I think it was fairly genuine. You've seen my Hail Caesar. You haven't seen my reel, have you?
I haven't.
I'll give you a link to the reel,
Yeah.
so you'll see a lot of the stuff there. You'll see there's a little clip of one of the commercials from old Tom Morris. He comes running up onto the golf course and he apologizes profusely for being late because his alarm didn't go off, and he's carrying this rooster under his arm. And so there's a little exchange, to present the Golf Channel from the other fellow, and then I whipped the old rooster, and I had to be very careful that it didn't hurt.
This is a live rooster.
It
yeah.
was a live one, yeah. I had to whip him out and say, "This is on you, Winston." I think his name was Winston. "This is on you, Winston." Yeah, I mean, all of that stuff is great fun. But at the end of the day, I got into my 70s, and somehow it became less and less important. My mother passed in 2003, and it didn't happen immediately, but some years after that, at one point, I was absolutely fixated with acting and the business, and I worked at. When you're working and you're on the set, you're working. But the real work is when you're not on set and you don't have a job, and that's when you're chasing the next job, and you chase it fiercely. On phones, you work the scene. And she passed in 2003, and I noticed some years later I wasn't that driving to get roles, and it wasn't that important. I'd get a role, I'd do it. At one time, every time you booked a job, you were over the moon. You're over the moon. Ah! And I noticed that wasn't really happening anymore. And once we got into a few years before the COVID thing, I noticed I was doing it because that's my job, and go out, and I reached a point by then where I was working fairly regularly, but I wasn't all that enthusiastic, and I thought long and hard about it, and I can't say this for sure, but I think what had happened was, and I can't talk for all actors, but I think actors come from the child that is often saying, "Mummy, Mummy, look at me, Mummy, Mummy." And they don't realize that they take that into adulthood, because a lot of actors need to be seen. That's really what I recognized. I was no longer needing to be seen. And if I went for a spell where I didn't get work, it wasn't bothering me. In other words, I was no longer needing to be seen. And I think it was associated with that woman who came at age 49 to look at my first show and say, I could see where you became an actor. I think Mummy was no longer there, and therefore I think I was largely dancing up and down, in other words, acting, to try and keep Mummy happy. For years, she wasn't happy that I was doing that. She wanted her son to be the lawyer.
But you got that recognition.
Yes, I got recognition after she'd passed.
Yeah.
which was sad. I'd have liked to have seen me to get recognition earlier, but it's the way the clock runs. You know, you can never change that. You can say, well, it would have been nice, but it wasn't. It didn't happen. So you know, it's just the way the cookie crumbles. But I think by the time she went, she was quite happy. The family were all together and doing well. And it was funny, I was saying to my sisters, my father passed in '92, my mother passed in 2003, and I remember we were all chatting a few years after that. And it suddenly struck me, I said, do you know something? And my eldest sister said, what? I said, we're all orphans. You grew up knowing of orphans, and these were poor little people who didn't have parents, and you know. And I said, we're all orphans. Mm-hmm. You know, it was strange, but yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting life, and I've reached the point now today when we all had lunch. It wasn't that many years ago when there was us, there were our parents, and then the grandparents' generation was there. Then they all went, and the parents went up, and they were the top generation. Then they, one by one, over a period of time went, and now we are that generation. There's no generation older than us, you know, so the clock ticks. The clock ticks.
All, yeah.
Matter of time.
But thank you very much for taking some of your time to go over that.
Well, thank you. It's been very, very interesting. I loved meeting you today.